I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. And today I have what I think will be something very, very interesting, thought provoking, and perhaps controversial. I'm actually pretty interested to go through this because it's a topic that's been broached with me before, and people have sent me these very cryptic emails and like, hey, look at these, look at how the world today works with the world of the Old Testament and whatnot. That's kind of what we're talking about. And honestly, I was kind of like, okay, yeah, you're kind of a bunch of weirdos. Leave me alone, please. But then Dominic approached me with this idea, and Dominic, being Dominic, I think many of you probably know him by now, has it really laid out very well, and I'm actually pretty confident he's not insane. And so I kind of heard him out a little bit, and it's actually very fascinating. And I do want to say before we get started on this, this is not something that's approved by the church. This is nothing that you have to believe. This is, I suppose you'd call it an interesting theory or theories, um, and take it as such. I think that's, if you approach this with the right mindset, I think it's a fascinating topic with, I think, no downside. So keep that in mind. Nothing that you have to know here. This is not church teaching. This is me and Dominic having a conversation about something that he's done a lot of research into and is going to explain to us very well here. And it really deals with the parallels between the history of the church and the history in the Old Testament. So that being said, Dominic, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin, very much. Right. Hello, everybody who I know. My name is Dominic. This to start with, I also have a little project where we make some Catholic cartoons and books of Glorious Heritage, so you might know me from there. I'm really excited to come on here. I have been looking into this topic for the last 7 years, and there's quite a backstory as to where it came from and how it started, but I have been absolutely convinced about this ever since then. And, like it says in the Gospels, when our Lord is walking with the disciples onto a road to Emmaus, and they said after he left them, he said, "Were not our hearts burning within us as he unfolded the scriptures to us?" And that's how I felt for 7 years about this topic. It really burns a hole in my chest, and I'm so excited to share it. So thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate it. The concept is very simple. And the concept is, would it be possible, or wouldn't it be interesting, I could say, if the entire history of the Catholic Church is somehow prefigured by the entire history of the Old Testament? And the reason why I initially speculated that a long time ago, when I started looking into this, is that I knew that the church was sometimes called the New Israel. I know that Pope Saint Leo IX specifically is quoted as saying that, and I'm sure you can find many quotes from saints and doctors of the church who've made such a non-controversial statement that the church is the New Israel. I mean, it's not that hard of a stretch to see that. But if that's possible, I thought, then wouldn't it be neat if I could find some kind of correlation between the two? So that's the premise. Behind me here, I have a brochure that I've made, and this is the summary of about 4 years of work. I have a website for this, and I have about a 500-page book that goes through details of church history, paralleling the Old Testament in unbelievable detail. But I don't want to, I guess, get the donkey and the cart in front of the donkey here. I just should probably just start with the summary. So all right, to lay out the picture here, just to see what's going on, to make it more simple to understand, I've broken down both the Old Testament history and church history into like these 7, or I think it's 8 color-coded time periods. And you can see them on that line that goes through the center of the graph. I have a white one at the very, very far left of the screen, then a red and orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, and black. So for the starters, let me just go through those time periods first, and then let's get the big picture, and maybe I'll stop there and see if you want to interject something, Kevin. But okay, so the very first period, so immediately behind me, I have a little chart here, which if I can get out of the way, you can see it. And those are explains the time periods and the name of each color-coded time period, but I'm going to have to cover that up while I talk to you. The first one is white. And I call that, you can call it whatever you want, but I call it the foundation time period. So in that time period in the Old Testament, that's the time of the book of Genesis and the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so this is where God founds his people Israel, formerly Jacob, on the 12 apostles. or the 12 sons of Jacob, excuse me. Okay. And then there's the story of Joseph and so forth. After that white time period, which I call foundation, we move into the red time period, which I call persecution. And that would be in the Old Testament. That is the Egyptian period of Egyptian bondage and slavery. Moving out of that red time period into the orange time period, I call that one establishment, because that's when the Israelites, they leave slavery in Egypt and they go off and they wander in the desert for 40 years and they go and establish their nation in the new promised land. So they have that period of the judges, where the judges have to fend off the tyrannical rule of different tribes, like the Philistines or the Amorites or the Midianites, but they're established themselves there. Okay. So after the orange period, I have the very big period, yellow, called kingdom. And that's when Israel gets their first king, Saul, and then their second king, David, and then all of David's descendants, all the way until King Solomon. So that's that yellow time period. It pretty much goes, I guess, from David to Solomon, all in that one stretch. And then something very seismic happens after Solomon's reign. He builds the temple in Jerusalem, but right as he's building it, or right after he's building it, there's a rebellion in the north of Israel, and the 10 northern tribes of Israel, they rebel and they split away from the covenant, the covenant that Moses made with God on Mount Sinai and the Mosaic Law. They split with their whole religion. They split with the temple sacrifice, and they go off into the north and they start a new quasi-Israeli-like religion in the north. They actually call themselves Israel, and the bottom tribes retain the name Judah, or the tribe of Judah, to distinguish themselves. But anyway, the north goes into apostasy, which is a quick way of saying that. Okay, so then you have this period after that where they have two nations: the nation of Israel to the north, which is an apostate nation, and the nation to the south, which is only a couple tribes, but they're the ones who keep the true religion. And that goes on for a little bit until the Babylonians come. And the Babylonians come and start the blue period, which is the exile period. That's where the Babylonians take the tribe of Judah and anyone who's faithful into Babylon. The northern tribe gets assimilated prior to that, which is, we'll just kind of leave that alone for a little bit. During the blue period, there's a 70-year period where they are in Babylon as captives. And then at the start of the purple period is the period where King Cyrus, the Persian king, he takes control of the land, and he says to the Jews in Babylon, listen, I'm going to let you go back to your city in Jerusalem, and you can keep it as effectively as a city-state. You still owe allegiance to me, the Persian king, but I'm going to sign this, what they call the decree of Cyrus. I'm going to decree that you can go back and keep your religion and your religious laws only inside of Jerusalem. Outside of Jerusalem, you have no authority there, but inside of Jerusalem, you can have your religious city-state. And that goes on for a little bit. That's the book of Esdras and Nehemiah, and that is the story of Queen Esther. All that takes place in that purple period. And then finally now, we move into the books of the Maccabees, and that is where I call that the temple takeover period, because that's where the evil king Antiochus, he goes into the temple, he puts up a second altar in the temple over and against the true altar of God. He sets on that second altar an abomination of desolation, and he outlaws all traditional Jewish practices, and he mandates this new pagan religion. And so that the temple is stripped of all its ornaments, and anyone who's faithful has to flee to the mountains. Like our Lord says in the gospel, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place, spoken of the prophet Daniel, flee to the mountains. That happened in the books of the Maccabees, because it mentions that term, abomination of desolation, in the books of the Maccabees itself. And that's what they did when they saw it. They fled to the mountains. Mattathias and his sons, the Maccabees, fled there and fought back. So anyway, in a nutshell, it's a very quick overview of the Old Testament, and those are the time periods. When I was looking at this in terms of church history, I didn't know the Old Testament that well. I just simply had a very basic idea that the Old Testament people started small, they got big and got small again. That's all I really kind of knew. And I kind of thought, well, look, at the church had a similar pattern. 12 apostles started very small, and then in the Middle Ages, Christendom ruled all of Europe, and they were spreading the faith without much opposition. And then they got back to this position that we're in today. So I thought, oh, there's a general pattern there. I started to drill down for details, and I was able to kind of piece together some milestones, some big events that I could say this seems like a good parallel, and then let's look in between those for some smaller ones. And with that kind of systematic approach, I was able to put together a 500-page book that blows my mind in the amount of details that are in there. But I'll let it to the viewer and the listener to determine if that's just me seeing images in the clouds and making shapes out of marshmallows, or if that's actually legitimately concretely there. So
well, I have to say that as you're going through it, it's already in my mind. Like, I see where this is going, and I can tell already some of the the parallels, I suppose, which is pretty interesting.
Sure.
Especially again without you having to
Yeah, right.
explain it
That's
to
good
me.
to know.
That's yeah, it is interesting. I think you do see immediately how it's kind of connecting here. That's fascinating.
Sure. Okay. So what do you think? Should I go through church history real quickly, or do you want to
Sure.
take it a different direction?
No, go for
Okay,
it.
great. Okay, all right. So let me first do the church history overview as I just in the same fashion I did with the Old Testament, and then we'll see how we go. But okay, so starting with the church, we have the foundation of the church, which of course was our Lord's passion, death, and resurrection. Founded, the merits of his passion are spread to the world through the church, and he founds the church on the 12 apostles. So here you have the easy, that's an easy one, that's low-hanging fruit. The 12 apostles and the 12 sons of Israel are paralleled, right? And in fact, like that's been pointed out by wonderful church fathers throughout the ages, I'm sure. This is something that's kind of interesting when I looked at Joseph, Jacob's son. Remember, Joseph was Jacob's preferred and favorite son. He gave him the coat of many colors and everything. Well, when Joseph, he went to Egypt, so Egypt is the place of the eventual persecution of the Israelites. But it wasn't when Joseph went there. He went there, and then Pharaoh changed Joseph's name because Joseph had direct knowledge from God. Remember, Pharaoh said, the interpretation you just gave me, only God could have done that. So therefore, I'm changing your name, Joseph, to Zapanathanaea, and I'm going to give you this ring that puts you, the signet ring, and only myself will have greater authority in all of Egypt. And then Joseph was given control to like open and close the gates of the granaries, so to speak, right? And so you have, in church history, you have St. Peter answering that question about who do people say that I am? And St. Peter answers correctly. And our Lord says, only because God the Father told you that, therefore I'm going to change your name to Peter, and I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So both of them had their name changed, were given an item that signified their authority, and they were both put in charge of the whole kingdom, except for the one person who had authority over them, meaning, God had more authority than St. Peter, so to speak. I mean, but Joseph also with Pharaoh. And they both were the chosen of the 12. They both were one of 12. And they both led their people to the eventual place of their persecution, because St. Peter centered the church in Rome in years to come, which would become the center of the Roman persecution. So both of them had that same very strong parallel there. I mean, it's too much to deny in my mind, I think. Okay, anyway, then the church, of course, goes through the Roman persecution, all right? And then, so right behind me, if I can point here, let's see, there, okay. There's this moment in 406 that is just after Christianity became legal, and it's called the crossing of the Rhine River, which is kind of up in your neighborhood here, Kevin. So in 406, it's like 11 or maybe 12. I guess the argue is impossible to know, but it's in that ballpark. I remember doing some research on the internet, of course, internet research, but about 12 tribes, they crossed over the Rhine River into the Roman Empire. And that was the start of the barbarian invasion of Rome. Rome fell, of course, in 476, a couple of decades later. But those tribes would eventually become Catholic. They would convert and become the foundation of Christendom. Just like the 12 tribes of Israel around that same time period in the book of Joshua, 12 tribes crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land and founded the nation of Israel. So you have like these events that happen, like, they correspond like right above each other. Okay, but so anyway.
So wait. So real quickly, you're saying that Bavaria is the Promised Land. Is that what I'm?
Yeah, right. Well, for the barbarians, it totally was, right? Yeah, I mean, they had wheels and fire and I don't know, like prepared meals and bathhouses and everything there that the barbarians, I'm assumingly they were living in thatched roof houses. They were very politically disorganized, I would imagine. I mean, they were at that point, actually. I know that. Anyway, so let's continue. But yeah, so you're living in the promised land. Do you feel like it?
Sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's good. Okay. All right. Okay. So you have in this time period, you have the heart or the center of the period of the church fathers. I mean, the period of the church fathers stretches back with St. Ignatius of Antioch, but really the meat and potatoes of the church fathers is happening between the 300 and 500, 600s, about that. Just like how the period of the judges is happening in the Old Testament. The church fathers act as a kind of a period of judges for us, in so much as that the church fathers would have to bat down and fight against various heresies that popped up all over the place, just like the judges would do the same thing with enemy tribes. They were threats to the nation, so to speak. It's very hard to talk about these parallels without wanting to get into details, but I'm just going to leave it there for a second. Okay. In this time after the Roman persecution, the church is establishing itself and legitimizing itself with the Roman Empire. Like, it would become, like, you have Emperor Theodosius, who makes Nicene Christianity or Catholicism, he makes it the state religion of Rome, further establishing the Catholic Church and making it, it's getting it ready for the kingdom period coming up. But anyway, there's one event that I want to point to specifically that happens in this time period, and that's the conversion of Clovis. Happens in around 500 or so. Saint Clotilda, she comes and marries Clovis, who is either an Arian or a pagan, and then he converts to Catholicism. So his conversion facilitates the conversion of the entire Frankish tribe, which sets. When I read about this in the annals of history, they would say the Catholics of the past said that without Clovis's conversion, the rise of Charlemagne a couple centuries later would have been impossible, because Charlemagne was a Frankish king who comes from the same tribe as Clovis, and his conversion tills the soil for his rise, right? Similarly, how behind me here, if I can move out of the way, you have the conversion of Ruth and her marriage to Boaz in that same time period sets the stage for King David to rise a little bit later on. King David is the great grandson of Ruth and Boaz. So without her conversion, you wouldn't have King David. Just like without Clovis's conversion, you wouldn't have Charlemagne. Okay, so that's important. We'll get into that later. Okay, so moving through the Orange period now into the Yellow period. In the Yellow period in church history, you have the first empire that takes its crown and from the church and protects the church as its it self-identifies with the church and protects it, right? Like the Roman Empire did that a little bit, but you had Arian emperors, and you had Catholic emperors and Arian ones again, and so forth. But the Byzantine Empire was like the first one. It said it bowed down to the Patriarch of Constantinople, and it had a crown placed on the emperor's head, and then it vowed to protect the church and Christianity, and that would be akin to King Saul. So the Byzantine Empire was the first, so to speak, empire guardian. But it also, like King Saul did, it displeased God because it refused to obey the Pope. It didn't recognize his authority, and it was an arrogant empire. The Byzantine Empire is a descendant of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it had this long pedigree of grandness and self-aggrandizement, and it didn't. That's one of the reasons why it didn't obey the papacy. It didn't see the papacy as something that was as great as itself, perhaps, right? So it saw the church as the Orthodox, the schismatic Orthodox say that the emperor was the head of the church, not the Pope. Anyway, this displeases the Pope, obviously, and so then in 800 AD, in 800, the Pope crowns Charlemagne by surprise. The story is that he calls Charlemagne to Rome, and he crowns him on Christmas Day, and Charlemagne says he didn't know he was going to be crowned. Just like how King David didn't know he was going to be anointed. Remember, Jesse came to Samuel came to Jesse's house and said, God told me to anoint one of your sons. And he said, which are your sons? And he said, are there any left? So David came out of the field, and all of a sudden he's being anointed king of Israel. So at that point, between when David was anointed, you had two rivals in Israel. Saul was increasingly aware that David was God's anointed and that he was going to threaten his authority and his power. Just like how the Byzantines, they were very upset that the Pope crowned a new emperor because they were the emperor. They didn't like having two. And especially this little upstart Frankish kingdom that just came out of the barbarian woods a couple centuries ago. But nonetheless, they became increasingly jealous of the Carolingian, the Holy Roman Empire, because they were effectively, the Holy Roman Empire was very effective on the field of battle, and they were very pious. They obeyed the papacy more or less, right? They didn't have this sense that they were greater than anything, because they knew where they came from just a couple centuries ago. So anyway, there's your King David there in church history. Moving forward from Charlemagne, you have the Great Schism of 1054. Would be akin to Saul and David finally parting ways. There's a point there where David says, I understand now, like, you're going to always try to kill me, Saul. And Saul understands also that David is on the rise and that he's going to be crowned king soon. So they split, and you have the Schism of 1054 happening. Okay, at that same time period, David starts to fight wars to defend Israel. So he goes on a war spree, and he secures the borders of Israel. David has some mighty men that help him on this escapade. And you also have, in church history, you have the Crusades, which also beat back the Muslim empires of the time. And it really gives Western Christianity a very safe space to grow and to blossom, which is what happened. That's where the Renaissance kind of flew out of that. The Renaissance came out of the security that Western Europe felt. They didn't have to protect their borders all the time, at least in the early Renaissance. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but let's move on a little bit past the Crusades until we get to the Papal Schism. So in the Old Testament, David, after David's wars are over, there's a point there where his son Absalom tries to claim the throne from David himself, even while David's still the king. And all of Israel doesn't know who the real king is. So there's a battle that goes on, Absalom dies. And then there's another point here before that happens, or shortly after that, where Adonias, his other son, claims to be king as well, while David's still there. So at one point, you even had two or three. And so you go to the Papal Schism, you have the same thing happening in church history, where you have two rival claimants to the papacy, and then at the end of it, a third. Right? So there's your Papal Schism. Following that is the Renaissance, and that is clearly the reign of King Solomon. During King Solomon's reign, he starts off very, idealistic or pure. He wants to rule over God's people with integrity and wisdom. But then he starts to marry all these foreign wives, and he brings corruption and false religions into the orbit of Israel. He starts building a construction project. The temple comes out of that, but also he builds a lot of other cities in the north. He introduces wisdom, art, architecture into Israel, just like the Renaissance does in church history. We have this massive explosion of amazing architecture, but we also have art and wisdom and science invention, but we also have the beginnings of the introduction of humanism back into Christianity. That's where you have these, they're digging up the old books from the pagan Romans and the pagan Greeks, and they're finding the humanistic ideas of art and philosophy, and they're kind of interjecting them. Catherine de Medici at this time was horrible for that. And so you have, again, like this parallel time in both people's histories. Okay, now after King Solomon, or shortly after, Jeroboam, he is a general in Solomon's army, I believe, and he says, listen, the people in the north are really tired of these high taxes that are used to fund your opulent lifestyle and to fund your construction projects. He's saying this to King Solomon's son, as Rehoboam, I think, Rehoboam. He says, lower the taxes or we're going to rebel against you. And of course, Rehoboam says, no way. You thought my dad was hard. Wait till you see how hard I am. Well, lo and behold, Jeroboam, he revolts, and he starts a new religion in the north, making himself the head of that religion. And in church history, you have Martin Luther saying that, listen, the church is allowed to sell indulgences. That's not wrong. But the Council of Trent did condemn the abuse of the selling of indulgences, right? You can't do it abusively. Well, Luther didn't distinguish between that, but he said, he didn't complain about taxes, but he did complain about the way that revenue was being generated to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. And he went to Rome and was kind of disgusted with the opulent lifestyle of some of the clergy, which was true. I mean, Pope Leo X had a very opulent lifestyle, right? So Luther, he rebels for the same reason, and he goes off and starts a new religion in the north as well. So they both do the same thing at the same time, okay? The parallels between them are amazing. Each one of these points here has pages and pages of sub-parallels underneath them that are just astonishing. I don't want to get into all of them. I don't want to get lost in the weeds. But okay, moving on. All right. So now you have this period here where the Catholics in the South and the Protestants in the North, they fight a series of wars, just like they did in the Old Testament. There was a series of wars that was fought. They come to a stalemate because the wars were so bloody in both instances, and they start to make a relative peace between themselves. That happened in church history at the Peace of Westphalia, where they put forth that doctrine, he who rules his religion. I forget how you say that in Latin, but it was pretty much like, okay, listen, we're fighting this to a bloody standstill. We're just going to agree to disagree and move forward. I'm kind of paraphrasing that, so I might be getting it a little bit wrong, but it's in a nutshell, it's what happened. Okay, so we got to move on. I want to get into the details, but I can't. I shouldn't. Right. So now you have this goes on in church history until 1789 in the French Revolution. Okay, so in the Old Testament, the Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, he ends the very last Davidic king, which is King Zedekiah. He's the last one to sit on the throne. And in church history, the French Revolution deposes the last French king, right? And then later on, Napoleon comes around a couple of years later, and he deposes the very last Holy Roman Emperor, which was Francis II. He deposes him in 1806. So here you have, if you have Charlemagne being like the King David, who starts the Holy Roman Empire, you have Napoleon deposing the very last one in 1806. Just like Nebuchadnezzar deposes the last Judean king that was started by King David in the Old Testament. You can see right there on the screen, they parallel. Okay, so the church now, and Catholics in the church finds itself now, for the first time since the rise of Charlemagne, it finds itself now ruled by secular atheistic people in the 1800s, as governments across Europe all fall to secular republics and secular ways of thinking. There's a little bit of a resurgence of that, but then it comes crashing back in the late 1800s. And this is why you have, like in the movie The Song of Bernadette, which we've probably all seen, you have the elite class, the ones who are ruling, like they all get together in a little cafe and they twist their mustaches and they talk about science. Okay, they're all the ones talking about science and invention and the superstition nature, the superstitiousness of religion, right? That was the environment the Catholics saw themselves in after the French Revolution, more or less. Okay. And that's akin to the Israelites living in bondage, or in exile, under non-Jewish laws and non-Jewish mindsets. They're ruled by Babylonians, who were very secular, by the way. I was reading about the Babylonian. They had a religion for sure, but they valued secular laws because they had such a plethora of different religions in their empire. So they kind of ruled by secular law also, mostly. Anyway, moving on. Okay, the Papal States now in 1870, this is key, the Papal States were taken away from the church in 1870 by the Freemasonic Italian government. And so now, for the first time since the days of Charlemagne, the Holy See had no land, and they were prisoners in the Vatican. So that's the same as the Israelites being taken out of their land and being prisoners in Babylon. What happens now is this is a very poignant parallel. In church history, after about 60 years or 70 years, there's 2 dates to go by. Mussolini comes along in 1929, and to curry favor with Catholics, he signs the Lateran Treaty, which gives the Holy See the city-state of Vatican City, so that the Holy See can rule over its own land again with its own religion and with its own laws, just like how the decree of Cyrus gave back Jerusalem as a city-state as well. It says in the Lateran Treaty that before an Italian bishop takes up his see, he must swear allegiance to the Italian king. Just like how King Cyrus says that you can have your own laws in Jerusalem, but you still owe allegiance to the Persian Empire, right? So there's a continuity there. They both give money. King Cyrus gives money to rebuild the temple and gives money for their return, just like the Italian government gives a lump sum payment to the church and an annuity every year. It pays an annuity for the upkeep of the Holy See. So they both give money. Okay, and then finally, we get to the end of church, well, arguably the end of church history, okay? Because we're at the end of the Old Testament. And here you have Vatican II come along. It does, in essence, the same things that happened in the books of the Maccabees. They put up a second altar in our churches. They outlawed the traditional Latin Mass. They mandated the Novus Ordo. They stripped all the ornaments out of our churches. And then here's what's really interesting. There was one very significant bishop who resisted. Now, there were many significant bishops. I'm not saying there weren't, but the one that the one is like the one that's most noticeable, I should say, was the Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. He fled to the Alps, just like Mattathias in the Old Testament fled to the hill country of Judea. So they both flee to the Alps, and they do so for the same reasons. They're trying to preserve tradition. Mattathias is old, so he passes on his rebellion to his sons, the Maccabees, and the Archbishop is old. He's getting old and has cancer, so he consecrates 4 bishops, his ecclesiastical sons, to carry on. Here's where it gets really interesting, though, is because as you go through the books of the Maccabees, you start to see that the Maccabees start to compromise with the people they formerly were fighting against. So at the beginning of the books of the Maccabees, they're taking titles, or they're rejecting titles from the Greeks, and they're very idealistic. But at the end of the book, the second generation Maccabean uprising, revolt, is swapping out soldiers with the very people they were fighting against. They're making treaties and allegiances with them. They're trying to they're making compromises with them, right? Which is what we see, sadly, the SSPX doing now. But that's what happened. It's what it is. So this is the nucleus of the parallels, right? So that's okay. So one thing, obviously, one more thing here before I'll kick it off and see if you have any reactions. But what struck out to me so much in this is that the Novus Ordo is so clearly parallel with the Abomination of Desolation in the books of the Maccabees. If anything parallels, that would be it, because it's placed on the second altar in the temple of God, and it was mandated to be done by the pagan ruler. So, so like that one really struck me as like, I mean, there are many abominations that bring desolation. The Pachimama, they're all over the place. So no one can deny that. But our Lord did say, when you see the abomination spoken of by the prophet Daniel in the holy place, flee to the mountains. And when you see that the Novus Ordo in this system of parallels has such a clear tie to that abomination, that really kind of makes it stand out in my mind. So I'll let that go for now. But what do you think?
Whew, yeah, boy, it's a lot to take.
I know,
in,
it's a ton.
sure.
Yeah,
it's kind of overwhelming, but
I know.
it is pretty interesting, and I think it's a. I mean, I guess my I got a couple questions, I suppose, and big overarching questions, because I mean, I think in general, as you said, I think I'd have to read your 500-page book because it sounds interesting. Because I think
recommend it.
I think it's something that you, once you touch upon it, it's kind of like, well, that's okay. I do want to know more about the parallels behind it, because I think that is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my questions would be these. I mean, number one, which is unanswerable, of course, is why would God make this so? Of course, we have no answer to that, so I'm not asking you that question. I just think it's interesting. Why is there that parallel? And I guess the second question is, why do we need to know this, or why is this? Why is it worth reading a 500-page book? And that's maybe something you can answer better.
Yeah, well, first of all, I wouldn't recommend reading the 500-page book cold. I mean, I want to write a better book that's more reader friendly. Like the book I wrote is just simply it's like a technical manual. Like this is like, it's not meant to read through with easy reading. It's more like all my thoughts I just threw onto a paper and try to organize it. I did though. Let me switch screens for a second here. 1 second. I'm going to show you what I did do. I'm going to play this video. As I talk, I'll play these things.
Okay. Can you change your mirrored? Go to your settings and change the mirror.
Oh, is it not backwards?
It's backwards for me. Yep.
Sure. Okay.
Which is strange, because your map was fine, or your timeline was fine, but your videos are backwards. There you go. That got it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I forgot to flip it. All right. So as I go, I did make these graphics, and these are part of the book. So I'll go through. These are just some of the parallels that are chronological in date, and then you can read about all these. So that would be in the book. So it does have some kind of user interface, like graphical presentations that make it a little bit easier. But I wouldn't. You can read the book. Go for it. But let me touch your first point about why God would do this. Well, obviously we don't know who knows the mind of God, but it is interesting to point out that at the end of the gospel, our Lord showed the disciples on the road to Emmaus that his life was totally, I guess prefigured is a good word, or foreshadowed, right? Or the whole Old Testament foreshadowed Christ. And so he unveiled the scriptures to them on the road to Emmaus. And they got to see that everything that happened to him, his whole life and his whole death, resurrection, was all foreshadowed by the Old Testament. So if the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church is the mystical body of Christ, it also is Christ, then it would stand to reason that in the infinite order of God, his simplicity, his order, his articulate. Anyway, in the work of God, it could also be possible that just as Christ was prefigured by the Old Testament, why couldn't our Lord's mystical body also share the same prefigurement? Right? I mean, so that's something to consider, because this is our story as well. So that's one thing. You asked me something else, and I can't quite remember. Why should we need to know this? Or is that
right?
Okay, all right. You don't have to know this, right? So, I mean, the reaction to the Novus Ordo that we had as traditional Catholics, right, to say to the contest, was to flee from it without having to know that it parallels the abomination per se in the system of parallels. So it's not like this is necessary for. We were just listening to one of your podcasts by one of the priests who gave an excellent talk about prophecy and how false prophecy tends to say you have to know this for your salvation. He was talking about the blessed candles or the 3 days darkness, all that stuff, right? So I agree. Like this is not necessary, and I'm not trying to claim it is. But I want to say though that it's consolation, and it's also beauty. So like this leads us back to understanding the history of our church. It leads us back to understanding the Old Testament, which are two very good things. And it also leads us into the conclusion that we have to flee from the abomination, whether we did or not. If we did flee from the abomination, it's consolation that we did the right thing. If we didn't flee from the abomination, that it calls those people to get out of the Novus Ordo, which was the reaction of a handful of people over the last 7 or so years. I've been doing this on YouTube, and I have my own website. There are, I'd say, about 7 to 10 people that I know personally that have come out of the Novus Ordo, if not largely because of this, then solely because of this, at least initially, right? This provides the impetus to go, whoa, if these parallels are real, then only God could have done them. And if God did that, then therefore, like, I'm going to give it some very heavy thought. And then it spurs them on to read the arguments about, how evil the Novus Ordo is. And they get the concrete answers from theology. But this gives them that spark that says, I can see now the parallel for it. Now I need to learn the reasons why behind it. So it has driven people out of the Novus Ordo, which and I'm sure there's some people listening to this right now. I know for sure who listen to your podcast, who follow my stuff on that. But like, it's like you can't really say it out loud because it hasn't been brought out into the open yet. So it's like, and there's no reason to say it out loud. I'm not trying to say like, speak up, my people. That's not what I'm trying to say. But like, I mean, what I'm trying to say is like, there are people that see this. I don't want to call anybody out by name, but there are some very intelligent people who have some very respectable professions that have said like, this is absolutely real, right? And that I'll stop right there. I don't want to give any more away, but I don't want to. Yeah, okay. So did I touch upon all those things? I think there was one more thing that you mentioned that I forgot to touch upon.
No, I think that's the primary question, I suppose, because I mean, I think again, if someone's going to, I find it interesting. I find history in general interesting. So I find church history, of course, fascinating, and to be able to connect it to the Old Testament, which I fully admit I don't know much about.
Yeah, sure.
It does honestly also make me more interested in learning about the Old Testament, and I think if that connects to the New Testament, that it's first of all, it's just fascinating, and I think, and as you say, it can connect us to see the truth, and even if it's even if it's not true, even if these connections are just your connections and, they're just you making leaps, which of course I'm not saying, but I mean, let's just say they are, it is still, to me, it's a good impetus for us to go and do the research and look into it and find where did we come from? Because I think that's something that we often fail to do, right? We're so focused on the evils of the day, or, the Novus Ordo is so bad, and
Right.
but it's like, okay, well, how did we get to this kind of,
Right.
has it happened before in history? And I think that if we understand history, then we can be more likely to not let it happen again. And I think that's something that's certainly worth the time and looking into, I suppose.
Oh yeah. There's a multitude of reasons why it's enrichment. It's at the very least, it's enrichment at the very least. So yeah, I completely agree. When you press into it, it can touch upon some uncomfortable areas as well. I'm not touching upon those right now, But like one of the questions that I usually always get is, well, what happens next?
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the I usually get. I told my wife that I would veer away from that right now, but like let me say though that let me pull up a different slide here and give you a little bit of a taste of what I mean. But okay, this is
the wife's shaking her head. Don't do it. Don't do it.
yeah, no, right. No, I'm not gonna. But this is okay. So when I was thinking about our Lord's words, when you see the abomination in the holy place, flee to the mountains, and he references that the prophet Daniel. He said, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. So I said, boy, oh boy, I have to see what the book of Daniel says, because I never really studied it intently before. There's many prophecies in there, but this is the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years prophecy from Daniel 9. And it mentions that there's going to be this, from going forth from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, there's going to be this series of weeks, it says. And then finally, it says in the final week of these 70 weeks, in the final week, the abomination of desolation is going to be placed, presumably on the altar, right? But it's gonna happen at the midpoint of this final week. So presumably, like the 3.5 units of the 7 units, which is the week of it. Now, knowing that we have a concrete date for when the Novus Ordo was established, so that gives me a concrete date to work from. And then from that point, you can kind of work the prophecy backwards and see if it makes sense. Oh boy, is it neat, because it does, right? So I thought to myself, well, Jerusalem was the center of the Old Testament. Rome is the center of church history. The Catholic Church is based in Rome. The papacy is in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica is in Rome. So let me see if there's a decree to rebuild Rome 70 weeks of years prior to that. And that's what I found. I found Pope Nicholas V. He's the Pope that's bringing the papacy back from the Avignon papacy. He's bringing it back to Rome. And he finds Rome in a state of disrepair because it was neglected for the 70 years in Avignon. So he decrees the building of a new basilica. He decrees the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. He decides we're going to have to rebuild the streets and redo the fortifications and just rebuild everything, basically. So I thought that's a good starting point, right? The decree to rebuild Rome. And I go for 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. And lo and behold, it takes me right to the Lateran Treaty in 1929. February 11th, 1929. And at the same time that's going on, Mussolini is also doing the same thing that Pope Nicholas V did. He's rebuilding the streets of Rome too. He wants to rebuild Rome into the capital of his new fascist empire. But he's doing it, as the prophecy says, in the straightness of times, or in difficult times for the church. I mean, fascism was pushing on Pope Pius XI, and World War II was looming, very difficult times. Anyway, so if you look at the Lateran Treaty as a potential start of this final week, I remember that Benedict XVI, he resigned on February 11th, the same day the Lateran Treaty was signed. And he resigned, lightning strikes the Vatican, and we all remember that. What does this mean, right? Lightning strikes the Vatican on February 11th. And then, okay, like I said, February 11th, the same date. Okay, in between him and the Lateran Treaty, his resignation is a claim to need 84 perfect years. 84 years is a perfect number, and it's divisible by 7. So I divided 84 by 7, and you get 12 years apiece. Like each day of that final week is 12 years. And lo and behold, smack dab in the middle of it, Paul VI mandates the Novus Ordo in 1971. So here you have the Abomination of Desolation in the middle point of this very clear period that's distinguishable by 2 dates of February 11th, and then you also have 42 years in between them. So when I see that, I go, well, that's the prophecy of Daniel. It does what it says it does. It starts off with the decree to rebuild Rome, and then it deals with the straightness of times. And then there's the abomination that we've determined from the parallels between church history and the Old Testament coming to play in the midpoint of what can be identified as some kind of final week. So that was really mind-blowing to me. And it has further implications because the book of Daniel ties into the book of the Apocalypse, which I can't get into right now. All right, but they do share the similar structure in that. And so let me say this: I don't want to push this issue per se, but I just want to kind of whet the palate of the listeners to see these parallels have ties into much deeper things. We could talk about it later. I'm not interested in pushing my agenda or my ideas about that, but I would be very interested in bringing these parallels out into a more serious discussion so that we can bat it back and forth, and the clergy can get involved if they want to, and also weigh these things out. Because, like, it's not that we have to do this, but at the same time, everyone has a sense that things are getting kind of crazy in the world, right? And perhaps some people might think that we're approaching the end. Some people might think that. I would have to think that this would be interesting, to say the least. It doesn't. I'm not talking about like getting a chip in your wrist or anything like that, right? I'm dealing with the Novus Ordo and prophecies in the book of Daniel that our Lord told us to look at. So that's it's like I just kind of follow one foot in front of the other and just say, well, I'm going to walk to the next step because it seems to lead me into this direction. I'll walk into the next step, and then I kind of stop and take a break. Anyway, okay, look, so that's what's going on there. I'll leave it at that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, getting anyone to get involved is always tough to say, as I'm sure you well know that it's yeah, that the whole topic is difficult because but I guess for me I always have an issue with it, like the video you mentioned that Father Gabriel talks about with the 3 days of darkness. And I think part of what I have an issue with is that it always becomes this kind of, yeah, the world's going to end next month, buy your candles, lock down your doors, stay at home, cry in a corner somewhere, and that's always been kind of my issue with this whole doom and gloom end of the world idea. But I think that I don't get the impression that's what you're saying. And what I like about it, you kind of have the Maccabees, and what I like about that is kind of imagine myself that I don't know how it ends, I suppose, but I picture that if that's in the era we're in, we've got to fight, and build and not and like actually like the last thing we should do is to crawl in a hole and hide until the end
Oh
time. So
yeah, absolutely.
and I think that's what I'm getting from what you're saying too. That's not the point. The point's not like, oh, here comes the darkness.
No,
The devils are
right.
outside. I don't think that's the
Yeah,
point. I think the point is,
yeah,
yeah, maybe the end times are coming or whenever it is. But the point is, we have to you fight, build, make, do. And I think that you're a great example as well from what you create, the content you create for kids. I mean, if you thought the world was going to end tomorrow, would you be creating cartoons for children? Probably not. And I think that's again, it's part of why I agreed to do this podcast. Part of it is because I'm interested in
yeah.
it, but part of it is because I can see your mentality is not doom and gloom. And that's refreshing for someone talking about the end of the world.
Good. Yeah, as you were mentioning that, I was going to say this is the great segue into like my cartoons. So you did it for me. But yeah, so this is what we make. And so this project, I mean, to be completely honest, it does flow from my study of church history that I've done, whatever, 7 years ago or whatever. But in this project, I incorporate absolutely zero elements of the parallels. Like that's not my intent. I don't want to. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just simply trying to bring out church history for kids. That's it. I mean, and honestly, I don't. I mean, I made one reference in the book of Charles Martel to David and Goliath, but that is on my system of parallels. But that's it. But it is like David and Goliath. I mean, he was fighting a massively powerful Muslim army, and he didn't have the weapons and the equipment that the Muslims did, and he still won. And Charles Martel did set the stage for Charlemagne, just like David did. Anyway, anyway, I'm getting off the track. But the point is, though, please trust me that I'm not trying to secretly put these parallels and prophecies into these cartoon books. I'm not, I promise. But I couldn't not share my love of Catholic Church history with kids because it's so cool, and it's just so. I mean, it's just we all know why it's important. I'll leave it at that. So this is Glorious Heritage. We do make cartoons and books, and now we're moving into actually. We're going to start a history podcast, 162 topics of church history from start to finish. Cool. We're going to try to hit like some of the big ones, and each video is going to be 10 minutes a piece. And we're going to have Mrs. Charity, our spokeswoman, our cartoon spokeswoman, is going to be in there and make it a little more lighthearted for the kids. And then we also are going to have some printables to go along with it. Hopefully, we're going to start that here in mid-November. We're just proofreading all of the 162 printables right now. It's taking me longer than I thought, but we're going to do that. And also in the far right corner, you see Saint Philomena. That's our next cartoon coming out. We're going to have her done hopefully sometime in the third week of November, if not hopefully sooner. And then, yeah, I think that's all the big ones there. Oh, another one. I want to announce that we have someone stopped me after Mass on Sunday, and she's I don't want to give her name because I don't know if she would approve, but she's a fantastic artist, and she has asked if I would like some of her artwork to be coloring pages for the kids. So she's going to draw coloring pages, and I'm just so excited to have her. So she'll be, I guess, she has some projects she wants to finish up, but I mean, a lot of you might already know who she is, right? But I don't want to give her name. But so that's another exciting thing we're doing too. So yeah, so please check out our website and go there and look at the cartoons, look at the books. But also, when you go onto the website, there's a box that pops up on the homepage. Enter your email and if you're comfortable, your phone number, so we can contact you when we start the history podcast.
No, and it's something that I can definitely recommend myself. My daughter was sick the other day, so we downloaded one of them and watched it a few times about St. Simon's Stock, which was very good.
Oh, good. Okay.
Very, very good stuff, and it is, and I think again to instill in our children, not just the knowledge of history, but the desire to learn about history, and I mean, how much more interesting is Catholic history than any movie you're going to see? I mean, come on, you look at especially like Disney movies or something else. I mean, they're just terrible stories. They're so shallow. And you look at Catholic history. I mean, you're talking about Saint Philomena, Saint Simon's Stock. Look at I mean, eventually, I'm sure you're going to get to the Battle of Lepanto.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm waiting for that one. I mean, it's just like stories that are so incredible. You can't. The First Crusade, you did cartoons on that, and just like they're so incredible that you can't make them up, and no one's even tried to make movies about them. But I think that these are the things that they're not just informative for children. These are what sparks their interest in history, but especially in our faith, because they say, these people existed. They were real, and they actually did these things, and that really enlightens in them, or lighten them a fire for, hey, what could I be? What could I do? Maybe I'll be the Maccabean or the Saint Philomena, and that's what it's all about.
Absolutely, I completely 100% agree. I mean, when you watch the movies of the world, even if it's a movie you're allowed to watch, even if there's no immorality in it and things in that, there's no connection with the higher ideals of the faith. At best, you're going to have the motto or the lesson of the movie is to be honest, which is a wonderful thing. But you're not going to have the lesson of the movie be you should be a martyr for the faith of Christ, or you should there's nothing directed towards the supernatural ends that our faith points us to. And so at best, that a lot of these movies that we watch that are okay to watch are still pointing you to natural goods, which is in and of itself fine, right? But what about the content where we can uncompromisingly and without any kind of like reserve, we can, as traditional Catholics, as Save the Contest, we can say to our kids, like, here, I'm going to put this in front of you, and it's going to, everything you hear in Father's sermon, everything that you read in the holy books that we read, now it's going to be in a cartoon format for you, and it's going to, whatever benefit cartoons have, or videos have, to that extent, it can inculcate those virtues and those ideas, the supernatural ends into their hearts and minds too. Which, like you said, they could be the next Saint Philomena. They could be the next Maccabees, right? So absolutely, I agree. I mean, I think that's so important, and I'm encouraged because and as far as I can tell, there's no one doing this because the traditional Catholic market for these cartoons has been always very small, but it's growing so much right now, because of and the major cartoon producers and content producers are all owned by the Novus Ordo, right? So you're not going to have anyone who has the ideological freedom or the theological freedom, so to speak, to produce these things, because they're always going to be tied to some error that they couldn't do it. But not us, right? Like I left the Novus Ordo. I reject it wholeheartedly. The seat is empty as far as I can tell. I mean, I just want to believe what the church teaches, and I want to embrace the church's past. So as far as I can tell, I'm unfettered, and I'm encouraged to be doing this. Hopefully it can catch.
Awesome. Well, Dominic, last question then. How can people who are interested in the church history and Old Testament parallels, how can they learn more about it? I know you have a channel. Maybe you can plug that.
Yeah.
Tell people, because I'm sure at least a couple of people who watch this are going to be like, oh my goodness, I want to learn more. So what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's hard. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you go to my YouTube channel yet, because when I was making these things, I was in my echo chamber, and I would make videos. I have 100 videos on there. I range them all through. I have summary videos. I have overview videos. I have specific time periods. I have all kinds of stuff. But I also get into the book of the Apocalypse and the book of Daniel, because it leads me right into that. but I was in an echo chamber when I made them. So if you watch those first, because that's like the candy, right? That's like, oh, let's go right to that stuff first, right? If you do that first, though, I wouldn't recommend that, because you really kind of have to understand the whole foundation first to see how it relates. So I wouldn't recommend that. I guess I would recommend just like going to the YouTube channel and finding the summary videos. There's 6 of them, or 7 of them, and you can go through. It takes you to the timeline, but it breaks down each color into more detail. You could start with that, or you can go to the website, which you'll see in the top right corner of the screen there. It says somewhere around there. It says it's www.maccabeanuprising.com. I apologize for the way Maccabean is spelled. It's spelled the Novus Ordo way. I didn't know that, because when I started this, I was still using a non-traditional, a fake Bible. Right? I rejected that very quickly, but I didn't know that yet. So I spelled Maccabean the wrong way. But now I bought the website, and now it's stuck. So it's MACCABEAN, MaccabeanUprising.com, and just go from there. Or please email me at Maccabean. What's my email address? I forget. Hold on. Let me see here. I'll tell you in a second.
Got too many of them, right?
Oh, man, I know. It's true. Okay, it's very easy. Okay, it's MaccabeanUprising@gmail.com. And, I prefer that if you want to know more about it, I prefer you do that first, so I can talk to you and find out, like, what level of understanding you're working from. Sure. and like that, because I don't want to send you off into a generic spot where you might not understand or get confused or get the wrong impression.
Perfect. Well, Dominic, it's been very interesting. Boy, that hour flew by for me. I hope it did for everyone else as well. I mean, and again, if anyone else is watching the slides go by as you were talking from that one video, it shows that you didn't even touch the surface of the material that you've got with these parallels. Very, very fascinating. Something that I'm interested in looking into more as well. Hopefully everyone else is too. If you like this, please like, share, subscribe, comment, all of that stuff on this video. And definitely go over to the websites, and also please go check out the cartoons Glorious Heritage. They're awesome. Again, what material can you recommend to everyone and know it's going to be totally clean and no worries, no ideology, no weird agendas, no, it's all good, it's all perfectly reliable, and it's honestly, you can't rely on that from anyone. So Glorious Heritage, go check it out. These guys, you can rely on it, and Catholic Family Podcast, hopefully as well. So stick with us as well. And yeah, Dominic, I imagine we'll see you around some other time. Until then, God bless you.
Thank you so much.